I'm Jared Weiss.
And I'm Alex Benson.
We are Ethereal Sunrise. We are back again uh, for one of our endless discussion videos discussing the aptly titled Endless War, Alex's third and final solo composition for the album. Alex, do you want to talk a little bit about the process of coming up with this one?
Sure. So this was the second of my individual songs to be written for this album. So I had written Not Done Yet, and then this one, and then Steady as a Rock was the last one. Um, so with this one, it was very much about trying to do some of the same things that were done and not done yet, but kind of in an inverse way. In that I still wanted to play with the fact that I had two vocalists to work with, um, but I didn't want to do it in the same way that I had done it for Not Done Yet. And so where with Not Done Yet, it was a lot of sort of opposition. With this one, it's much more kind of harmonies, or I would call it sort of peri-harmonies, and a lot of more sort of unison type stuff. Um, and the other way I wanted it to be sort of the inverse of Not Done Yet is that with Not Done Yet, all of its sort of complicated time signatures are really thrown in your face. And it's sort of like very obviously strange, and not just sort of sitting in one place. With this one, I wanted it to be much more kind of fluid and sort of seamless, and that you wouldn't necessarily realize that all those time signature changes were happening unless you specifically were looking forward. So what I wound up doing was using a lot of the changes um, of I would keep the same kind of uh, chord pattern, and then I would change the rhythm under it to sort of generate a sense of momentum. And the sort of overall influence from the song was a lot of actually kind of my Japanese composer influences and all the sort of uh, anime and JRPGs and all that stuff that I had grown up with, that I had been exposed to. So the Yuki Kajiura, who's sort of a master of polyphony, was a major influence in the structure of the song and in terms of how the actual parts that are there. And so I had wanted to do this sort of lengthy, extended intro that just sort of has as much atmosphere as we could muster, that then sort of snaps about halfway through into this really uh, hard hitting rock and roll song. Um, and, by the time it actually builds up to that initial snap into the chorus, that was actually a lot of progressive metal influence and much more kind of modern influences by Jeremiah standards. So, that's much more kind of a Dream Theater, Circus Maximus type segment, but also anchored in the fact that I had come up with this, played in fourths guitar riff that was very much a Richie Blackmore, Deep Purple inspired thing. Um, and so I had sort of combined those influences and said, all right, let's make it this like massive chorus, and just have our voices just, layered up the wazoo. Um, and then have that kind of then crash into this highly melodic verse that then sort of allows it to sort of carry through the rest of the song. And so it's kind of it's a bit of a backwards song in some ways, in that the main body of the song is kind of the second part of the song. Um, but it wound up making it a really different setup from the rest of the songs on the album, in that it was arranged that way. And once it sort of clicks in, it's very much a melodically driven song, although it is quite rhythmic as well. But there's far less of the kind of you know uh, fill types things that we were seeing on, like Soul My Soul, or those sorts of songs. And it was much more kind of a streamlined melody first type song.
Right, right. I think of all this, most of the songs on this album, I think, tend to have kind of a rougher edge to them, and not that this one doesn't. I mean, certainly in terms of the guitar tones, that heaviness is there. Um, but there's kind of a cool 70s album oriented rock feel to it, in the sense that the atmospheric synths do a lot in terms of kind of feeling in the forefront, even when they are even though they're really just kind of atmospheric chords a lot of the time. Um, and I think that kind of cool type 70s type feel is evidenced by how streamlined everything feels, how very easily structured it all feels, despite the fact that you're right, it is in sequence structurally a little strange. And when you really start counting, the time signatures are a little bit odd, but you would never know it. The choruses are in 15, and you would 15, right? I hope I got
I
that
think
right.
so.
Yeah, and you would never know it just because it's got that kind of cool uh energy to it. I almost sometimes with the synths I think of like Foreigners, Waiting for a Girl Like You, or something along those lines, with a harder guitar tone behind it. Um so it has always felt kind of unique to me on the album in that way, while still part of a whole, given kind of the shared guitar tones and things like that. It is a vocally fairly complex song, because of all
Hmm.
the layers you note, especially in the choruses and even in the intros. Multiple sections of harmonizing and alternating, lines. I've always enjoyed the intro in particular, because I am Jewish. You are not Jewish, Alex, unless you've converted and not told me. Um,
Yeah,
but in tone, in both the chosen enunciations and kind of the natural minor scales that are utilized a lot in those early sections, it feels a lot like, I'm in synagogue and we're doing our chanty type prayers. um I think it's the most Jewish sounding rock and roll song ever to be not written by someone who's Jewish. So I always get a kick out of that. um yeah. In terms of instrumentation on this one, this was more straightforward than a lot of them, where we were kind of hopping back and forth. I played the bass, and the bass part was entirely composed, I believe. I don't recall there being any.
I think that's
Um,
true. Yeah.
um, so I was just doing my groove, and the backing vocals, and you were, I think, pretty much responsible for the rest.
Hmm. Yep. Yep. So yeah, it took this. This was one of the, despite sort of being written in the middle, it was one of the earlier ones I think that we had started to record, and so I think it was actually one where we were forced to confront needing to actually learn how to record things properly and how to mix
Right.
things properly, because it is one of the sort of bigger um, tracks on the album. So this was where we, I think, cut a lot of our kind of production skills on the
Right.
in the early going. Um, and so yeah, I do think this was one where I had it more sort of tightly composed than some of the other songs, which were a little bit more room for um, improvisation or sort of input, creatively in terms of the part from Jared. Um, and in terms of the guitar solo, it's another kind of briefer solo, despite the fact that I, love and adore and like to bite my way into really hefty, long guitar solos. There is actually a fair number of quite short guitar solos on this album.
Yeah.
And this song, it's no exception, because I wanted it to be, diverse and big and bombastic, but I also wanted it to be contained in terms of its overall length, and to sort of let the more melodic nature of the song take precedence. Um, so that also wound up being, it's there and it adds color and it adds momentum, but it doesn't sort of overwhelm the song. Uh, and then from a lyrical perspective, I hadn't been writing it with synagogue specifically in mind. Um,
Right.
but there is definitely a more vulnerable edge to the song in terms of it being much more about loss and the kind of ambivalence that we all sort of go through with, like, how do we, honor those who've passed away, but also, move on, but is moving on sort of not respecting them, and all those sorts of questions that really don't have answers. And so that's sort of what is the endless war, is this sort of coping with loss. And so the fact that, those opening vocals are still conveying mournfulness, whether or not, it matches a specific culture,
Right.
was certainly intentional to try to capture that, all in the sort of setting of this, bombastic rock and roll song, and to sort of have that contrast be part of it.
Right. Right. And I certainly I think that comes through very effectively in the arrangement and kind of the way you structured the song. Now, there is one thing, and I foreshadowed this quite a number of videos back, but there is one thing I must hold you accountable for here. Can you explain the decision not to have any flute on this song? Because it's the only song on the whole album that lacks the flute. Um, we certainly shoehorned it into plenty of other places, and I remain at a loss for why it did not make an appearance here.
Yeah, I mean, there were only a few songs on this album where we had actually originally intended to use the flute. The rest just sort of were opportunities that came up that I largely availed myself of. But in this song, you know, the role that the flute would have been able to fill would have been to sort of add to the atmospheres, and really I wanted to use the vocals to do that. And I think that, if that additional voice of the flute had been in there, it may have actually kind of subtracted from it rather than adding. Um, and because it is more sort of a melodically forward song, and there's not a ton of space for the more instrumental breaks, there just wound up not being a particular space where that was really needed.
Okay. Well, that is certainly one perspective on the matter. Um, I would argue there is no space that a flute cannot, and frankly should not, uh, choose to occupy. Um, Frankly, the fact that the whole album is not one long 50-minute flute solo, I think is a waste, and probably will hurt our musical legacy going forward. But alas,
And
this
what
is
can
what
you do?
happens. This is what happens when you
Yeah.
decide to allow for solo compositions on a group album.
Yeah.
So maybe,
Well,
maybe,
yeah, the truth is I really just wanted to reach that audience that really hates the flute, and for them to be something, just one thing that they could be able to latch on to.
right. It is true that we can go to people and say, if you don't like the flute, what's wrong with you? But also, fine, here's a bone we will throw you. Uh, so I suppose there is value in that diversity if we're interested in catering to lower denominators. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this one, Alex?
I don't think so. This is one of my favorites on the album. I think it's probably my favorite of my three individual compositions, and that kind of managed to achieve the kind of grandeur that I was going for. So, and I think um, it provides a nice counterbalance in that it is sort of a more earnest and vulnerable song that's surrounded by either more intellectual songs or more kind of lighthearted fun songs. And so I think it sort of helps to bring that balance back into the equation for the album.
All right. Well, as always, you can find the song, you can find the album on any major music streaming or download platform. And you can find links to these things on our social media pages. We'll post a link to this particular song at the end of the video. And keep an eye out for more videos from us. Thanks for everyone who has listened. Thanks to everyone who watched this one. And we'll see you next time. I'm Jared Weiss.
And I'm Alex Benson, and we're Ethereal
We
Sunrise.
There we go.
Take
He
care.
beat me to it. See you, everyone.
Show it in your